On episode 87 of the Meat Mafia podcast, we had on Belinda Fettke. Belinda challenges plant-biased narratives with her research into the world of health and nutrition. She's exposed a number of connections within the food system and the dietary guidelines being pressed on people, shedding light on corporate interests and ideologies. In our conversation with Belinda, we discuss the Seventh-day Adventist nutritional story, medical institutions getting paid off by big sugar and big cereal, and religious ideology becoming global nutritional policy. Belinda became interested in these topics after her husband, Dr. Gary Fettke, became persecuted by the Australian medical boards. If you're interested in understanding how the medical system actually works from behind the scenes, this is the episode for you, so sit back and enjoy. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Equip Foods. Equip provides a complete source of grass-fed beef protein with no added chemicals, fillers, binding agents, or artificial coloring or sweeteners. If you're familiar with the supplement industry, you know that most supplements are loaded with ingredients that you can't even pronounce. Equip's Unflavored Prime has one single ingredient derived directly from grass-fed beef protein. For purists like ourselves who try to only consume balanced, real sources of nutrition, this protein powder checks all the boxes. Go check them out in the link below and use our promo code in the description to get a discount. We get questions all the time about how to incorporate beef liver into a healthy, balanced diet. The questions are usually around how to source high-quality beef liver, how to overcome the taste of liver, and how to travel and still be able to include beef liver into your diet. That's why we love Optimal Carnivore, which provides beef liver supplements as well as an organ complex for people to incorporate beef liver without the taste and with the convenience of just being able to pack it into a bag and toss it into your mouth when you're ready for your supplements. Beef liver is an important part of my diet because it provides me with the B12, copper, vitamin A that you can't really get from any other food groups. Beef liver is truly nature's vitamin, and being able to incorporate it in such an easy form, such as this supplement, makes it that much better. Go check out Optimal Carnivore and let us know what you think.
All right, we are live with another episode of the Meat Mafia podcast. Belinda, thank you so much for joining us.
You are very, very welcome. I'm just clicking off the thing that came up on my screen. Yeah, it's really nice to be here. Thanks, Brett. Sorry, Harry can't join us.
I know. Every once in a while we have to do a solo episode, but sometimes it adds like a different kind of flavor to the episode. And just to give some context for the audience, we had your husband, Dr. Gary Fettke, on probably about 2 months ago. We had gotten connected through a good mutual friend, Vidi Tortorich, and we had an amazing conversation with him about his work in regards to therapeutic carbohydrate reduction and everything that he had been through with the Australian medical boards. And when we were finishing up the conversation, one of the things that he had mentioned was a perfect part 2 to the discussion would be to have you on to discuss all the amazing work that you've done in regards to understanding the connection between nutrition, the corruption with the diet industry, the medical industry. So we're really excited. I think this is going to be an amazing conversation.
Thank you so much. I haven't quite got Gary's sense of humor, but I'll try.
Yeah. One of the things that we said before we hit record is that we were getting all this feedback from our listeners about how funny he was. So we'll just make up for it with the quality of information that we put out this episode. No, but I think a great starting point would be, if you don't mind, I think we would love to learn a little bit of just background information on yourself and Gary's trial. And we'll link to his episode in the show notes, but I think just kind of refreshing that from your perspective would be great and would be a great segue into the conversation.
Yeah, well, I think, but it's really important to understand that Gary's whole journey came from a health perspective, as did yours. So in 2000, I don't know if your readers or if Gary went into this, but in 2000, he was diagnosed with a very aggressive pituitary tumor. And it was so extensive at that time that he required surgery, chemotherapy, and radiotherapy. And nobody spoke about the fact that maybe he should consider his diet in amongst all of this. And it wasn't until years later that Gary looked back at his PET scans and realized it lit up like a Christmas tree to the glucose injection that he was given to diagnose his cancer. He ended up with a complication from the surgery and the tumor that's called diabetes insipidus. So it's quite different to the other diabetes. This one means you actually can't concentrate your urine. And it's a serious thing if it's uncontrolled, because you can actually pee yourself to death.
Wow.
You have to drink so much to counteract it. So he was told he may need, for a while until it got under control, drink 12 to 13 litres of fluid a day. That's how much he was peeing. And besides the fact it's totally exhausting, actually processing that amount of urine and peeing, he was told that water would probably be quite boring and maybe he should have juice. So not only in hospital was he recovering from a very aggressive surgery, for aggressive cancer, but then he was told he was drinking 10 liters of fruit juice a day.
Oh my gosh.
To counteract this insipidus. So it's no wonder in hindsight that this tumor just kept being so active and so aggressive. And in 2004, he had further surgery. He was on chemotherapy for about 11 and a half years. And a bit like you, he just went, you know what? In 2011, they said, we don't know what else we can do. And so he turned to Dr. Google and started researching and looking at a whole lot of things. He came across the work of Colin Champ and Dominic D'Agostino in America, where they were looking at sugar and cancer specifically. He was given a book from a lawyer, wrote a book here in Australia called Sweet Poison. And when Gary was first given it, he thought, what does a lawyer know about sugar that I don't know? I'm a doctor. You know, you've got to understand the first couple of years of medical education is all about biochemistry, physiology, anatomy, biochemistry, like it's all of those things right at the very beginning. And then the next 3-4 years, all they do is learn how to medicate and operate. They learn how to band-aid sick care because the concept of prevention just seems way beyond their ability. And I think it takes away some of the responsibility of a doctor. I'm not trying to take away an individual's belief, but the concept is we can't really fix this. So let's put the onus on the person. But if you band-aid that sick care, hopefully it'll make them better or, you know, slow it all down or whatever else. I don't know. So he was also told by a close friend who's a pharmacist to consider metformin because they were finding that it was having a side effect, an unexpected side effect. And so people who were going on to metformin for type 2 diabetes were finding that their cancer was going into remission. And the concept of this is that metformin takes the sugar out of the bloodstream and pushes it into the tissues. So that has another whole set of issues. But Gary thought, well, if it's taking sugar out of the bloodstream and their cancer's getting better, I'm going to give up sugar. And Gary's that sort of person. You've interviewed him. I'm giving up sugar today. That's it. It's
today,
gone.
yeah, exactly.
Today. Interestingly, it took a few months for him to work out that carbohydrates, starchy carbohydrates, are simply glucose the minute you ingest them. So he'd given up sugar, but he was still basing his diet, as our 1992 dietary guidelines had indicated should be done, with 6 to 11 serves of carbohydrates per day. So he was eating pasta, bread, rice, potatoes, you know, all of those things. And he's thinking, oh, I'm doing a really good job. I've given up sugar. When he gave up the starchy carbohydrates, the difference, I mean, he definitely started to improve his health, just giving up sugar, but the difference was amazing. And under supervision, he was able to come off his chemotherapy after a year of being low carb.
Wow. So was that 2014, Belinda?
2011, 2012.
Wow.
So he gave up. And so as his story was progressing, as his own health was improving, he reversed his own prediabetes, normalized his blood pressure, got rid of cardiac arrhythmias, got rid of GERD, like all of these issues that he'd had. And he also lost a lot of weight. So he became the healthiest version of him I've seen in a very long time as well. And understanding that doctors work ridiculously long hours, and Gary was operating sometimes all night, healing people from traumatic accidents and things. So the hospital just had ice cream. They had all these things that they could snack on all the time. So besides the fact he was drinking heaps of orange juice and fruit juices, all of these things, they were just adding up to everything. So his metabolic health was very poor by the time he decided he had to look at Dr. Google. And taking back control of his own health was amazing. But of course he was thinking, well, why is the hospital that I'm working in just flooded with junk food and sugary things? Like, I've got people in here who might have quite good control of their blood glucose at home, but they're coming into hospital for an operation and their blood glucose is out of control because the menus for diabetes in the hospital that Gary was working at included 3 desserts per day. So
3
people could have
desserts per
carbs
day.
for breakfast, 3 desserts,
Oh my
carbs for
gosh.
breakfast, cake for morning tea. You know, put those carbohydrates out all through the day. And Gary said, this is ridiculous. And as you mentioned, he was starting to recommend people reduce sugar and reduce carbohydrates. But he found, as many do, when you take those things out and you actually incorporate animal proteins and fats, it adds a whole nother layer to the healing process. And especially for people who had complications of type 2 diabetes and rotting ulcerations, like antibiotics don't fix that. Mm-hmm. But he was finding that when people improved their diet by reducing those carbohydrates and sugars and including animal proteins and fat, which is needed for healing, that he was seeing people improve. Their ulcerations were lessening. Certainly, people were able to improve their blood glucose and not actually develop these complications. That was the whole point of it. You know, Gary wasn't making money from doing this. He was making people better. And he said, fantastic. I mean, no doctor really goes into medicine wanting to cause harm. Mm-hmm. And I've talked about in my research that I've seen the last time doctors prescribed harm was with thalidomide. And that was back in the 50s and 60s. Women were prescribed thalidomide as an anti-emetic, anti-nausea drug for very severe morning sickness. But 12,000 children are documented as having been born without limbs. Wow. And that is horrific. But then look at the number of people who are losing limbs from the complications of type 2 diabetes from being prescribed medication instead of understanding that by changing their diet, they could actually not have to lose a limb. You know, Richard Bernstein, he's in his late 80s and he's amazing. He has been low carb since his 20s. He was an engineer originally, had type 1 diabetes when he was, I think, 10 or 11. And just understanding as an engineer that it made no sense to be giving insulin, counting carbs, eating carbs, giving yourself insulin. He just went, as a type 1, you have to have basal, but the bolus just didn't make sense to him. So he studied medicine in his 20s, later 20s, and then worked out this amazing protocol of using smaller amounts of insulin over the day and pretty much getting rid of all carbohydrates and sugars. And he has no complications, but he was already developing them in his 20s.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And this is the fear. People with type 2 diabetes, it used to be a disease of old age. And so the government didn't really have to worry about it. People didn't develop until they retired, and often they passed away before the complications had set in severely enough to be a concern. But we've now got children being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And unless we can help improve their health, they're going to develop the complications, which are this really serious part of it, in their 30s. In their 40s, they're going to be losing limbs, eyes, kidneys. You know, this is a tsunami of incredible complication, and it just needs to be stopped. So this is where Gary went to, and he got silenced.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And I think what's the statistic? I think it's 37 million Americans alone have diabetes. And I think over 90% of that is type 2 diabetes, which is particularly the type that you're speaking about. One of the things that Gary mentioned when he came on, it literally gives me chills up my spine to think about how, I think he said one of the catalysts to him starting to talk more about nutrition with his patients was this, when he would perform an amputation, the sound of placing like a foot or an amputated limb into a bucket. Like
he didn't place it. He was soaring off and it dropped.
Yeah. And he said it was just such a chilling experience that was really the catalyst for him to say, okay, I need to do something about this. And if I actually want to have an impact, we need to start taking preventative measures as opposed to acting reactionarily. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Because 20 years ago, you might only see someone who required an amputation once or twice a year. Like it was very rare. And when I'm saying amputation, it might even just be a little bit of toe. You know, the fact that Gary was starting to see someone every single week in his public health clinic in Tasmania, we've got a catchment area of about 120,000 people. He was seeing someone every single week requiring some sort of debridement. And it's heartbreaking. You're causing someone to have you can't return it. Like they've got this disability for life. And when you know, then you can actually make things better by just simply recommending changes in diet. It brings joy back to medicine. You know, you don't want a Band-Aid sick care. So I think he started getting quite loud. In fact, he went to the dietetics department at the hospital. He was almost skipping, like he was so excited about what he was discovering. And he said, oh, you won't believe it. I've worked out and I've been chatting to people around the world, and it's really important that we reduce sugar from the diet for people with type 2 diabetes. And I'm not sure whether the dietitians department didn't want to know about this information, or they didn't want Gary to be the first to talk about it, because instead of rejoicing and getting excited with him and seeing changes, a dietitian reported him to the medical board.
Wow. Yeah, and I absolutely want to dig into that with you. I'm just very quickly curious. One of the things that you mentioned that I did not know about is how from 2013 to 2015, he started doing some of his own carbohydrate reductions, cutting out sugar, refined grains, et cetera. It had a huge difference. And I'm just curious, with you being his wife, what was your thought process to seeing your husband start to go through this transformation on his own?
It was amazing watching him change. So I reckon about 2011, the light bulb moment about sugars. By 2012, certainly carbohydrates. And later in 2012 is polyunsaturated oils, seed oils, man-made. Okay. So it took about a year, I think, to consolidate all of his understanding. And he calls it his metabolic theory of metabolic disease is those three things: the sugar, the carbohydrates, and polyunsaturated seed oils. And seeing his transformation in his health was incredible, but seeing his excitement going to other people as well. And you may have heard that we opened a clinic when Gary was reported to the medical board and told he was not allowed to speak about nutrition to his patients while they were investigating. He just was, well, I'm doing something about this because there's no way my patients aren't going to hear this message. So we had actually had a dietitian approach him and wanted to talk about reducing carbohydrates for people, especially for type 2 diabetes. So Britt and Gary got together and they opened up Nutrition for Life. And as it went on, we ended up with, I think, about 11 staff. We had accredited practicing dietitians, nutritionists, diabetes educator, health coaches, and support and ancillary staff. And we're making a huge difference. We had over 100 doctors actually referring people to the clinic. So Gary was really excited. Like, wow. Even though he wasn't allowed to talk about it, people were still getting the message. So, but that infuriated the medical board even more, and certainly the dietitians. So the whole story is in 2014, when he was reported to the medical board, he was told, you can't talk about nutrition, you can't talk about it on social media. So Gary and I think I mentioned before, I'm a photographer, and I had been on Facebook since 2007 as a photographer. So I was very used to social media, very used to doing graphics. Really, Photoshop was easy. Mm-hmm. So what we did was we changed Gary Fettke no fructose on Facebook, put up a big sign and made it Belinda Fettke no fructose, and did a really big post about the fact that a doctor wasn't allowed to talk about nutrition to his patients. And we had nearly 1 million views of that post. It went absolutely ballistic. And I think the medical board had never had that much of a response. Like normally when people are reported to the medical board, they don't want anyone else to know about it because potentially they might have done something wrong, or it's not a very nice accusation that they've had. But Gary's was absolutely trumped up, vexatious, just ridiculous. And he just went, everyone's going to know about this. Yes. It was about the same time as Tim Noakes had been reported as well. So they were going through the same sort of thing at a very similar time. Tim Noakes's was very public. Gary's was all behind closed doors. Like the medical board, the APRA medical board here in Australia is corrupt. And I say they create harm. Their message is, their mantra is that they're going to protect the public, but there's no way they're doing that. They're protecting industry. They're protecting the boys club. It's just shocking what's happening here in Australia with the APRA medical board, silencing anything, any discussion on mandates, on nutrition, on anything that won't support industry profiteering, I believe. So it's very concerning. But I was watching Gary, and he'd connected up with a guy called Rod Taylor in Melbourne, and Rod had just started a group called Low Carb Down Under. So Gary was very much involved in that from its initial stages. And I went along to the first talk, and this is before Gary was silenced. And I was just seeing these guys talk about the science and how excited they were seeing these changes. So when Gary was silenced, he wasn't allowed to speak, obviously, at Low Carb Down Under or anything else. But I just watched and I thought, Gary, Rod, and all these other people, doctors, dietitians, health practitioners, are talking themselves blue in the face about the science. But I don't think it's about the science. It didn't add up to me. Like, it didn't make sense. Gary just kept trying to, but this is right. This is right. And he was sending the medical board. He sent them pretty much a thesis. Every week he was collating more and more information and more research. And he'd actually highlight it all and send it to them next week, the next week. He was investigated for 2.5 years, and they honestly received a thesis of information, but still couldn't comprehend it. So what triggered my research was the fact that the APRA Medical Board brought in an expert witness to determine if Gary, as an orthopedic surgeon, could talk about nutrition to his patients. Forgetting that Gary had the same training as everybody else had, but he had a specialty of surgery at the end, but he'd learned basic biochemistry, anatomy, physiology. So this man, and I think I mentioned to you before, I had cognitive dissonance. This man had to be working for the sugar industry in my mind, because why else would he be saying that a doctor can't talk about nutrition or reducing sugar? So I did deep dives, and all of a sudden I came across this information to say that he was working for Sanitarium, which in Australia is probably the biggest, certainly Australian producer of breakfast cereals.
Wow.
Okay, well, that actually makes sense. It's not the sugar industry, it's the cereal industry.
Mm-hmm.
But as I started to think about it, just slowly in my mind, Sanitarium is owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so I say over and over again, this expert witness brought me to look at the cereal industry, brought me to look at the Seventh-day Adventist Church and their dietary principles. And his wife was working, or is still working, for ILSI, which was founded by Coca-Cola and vice president in 1978. So these things sort of seem to have a bit of a symbiotic relationship. It makes total sense why this man would be suggesting that Gary can't talk about nutrition.
Wow.
And the more and more I looked into his things, he was actually writing textbooks for dietetics throughout Australia. He's the eminent professor of nutrition for the Southeast Asia Pacific region. Like, he's the biggest gun. Why did they pull in someone so huge to determine if a tiny little orthopedic surgeon here in Australia, tiny in Tassie, he had 5,000 people following him on Facebook at the time, which I'd pushed him onto, encouraging, saying, this is a great platform. And whoops, set him up as a target. And, the world wasn't hearing his message. So why did they need someone so big to determine that he couldn't talk? So as I say, that's where my research went. And this is how I uncovered all of these things, purely because of the expert witness the APRA Medical Board brought in to silence Gary. And after 2.5 years of investigation, he was actually silenced. And the determination said that even if low carb, healthy fat principles ever becomes accepted best practice, you can never talk about it.
Why? Just because his specialty is supposed to be surgery? Is that what they're trying to say?
I was the most petty, ridiculous, childlike comment you could ever imagine in an academic document. This is meant to be something that's official document sent to a doctor sanctioning him for something that he's doing really bad. And they said, even if it becomes accepted best practice, you can't talk about it. To me, that is, as I say, APRA is not protecting the public. They are protecting something else. Why can a doctor not talk about best practice?
Yes.
He'd be reported for not talking about best practice.
Yes.
And then they'd deregister him. So there were so many things about this whole case. It took us 4.5 years to clear Gary's name. And as I mentioned to you before, Brett, I am a professional photographer and hiding behind cameras and not necessarily someone who stands out the front. And I did realize over time that I didn't just stand beside Gary. I actually took that step in front of him, and I used my voice to give him his back, because it was ridiculous what was happening. We had to go to the National Health Ombudsman in the end. And the only way it could be overturned, because this determination was lifelong and non-appealable in a court of law. So the only thing we could do was go to the ombudsman to say, there's something wrong with the process and it needs to be overturned. And once she sent this whole documentation to another board, they overturned it in a week. And he actually received a written apology. But as we were going along with all of this, we were able to get, under freedom of information, we were able to get the 845-page document that the hospital had collated to send to the medical board as the concerns of the hospital staff and different people. And within that, we found 2 documents that the CEO of the Dietitians Association of Australia had actually written to the hospital asking for Gary to be silenced.
Wow.
So again, you go, this is Dietitians Association, this has gone to the highest level. So in all my deep digging and deep diving with my cognitive dissonance, I uncovered some documents from the cereal industry. And it was called the Australian Breakfast Cereal Manufacturers Forum. And they were a group of 4 cereal industries with a hashtag cereal for brekkie. And it was their minuted documents that I discovered. Sorry, hit the phone.
No, it's okay.
It was their minuted documents that actually named Gary as targeted for active defense.
Wow.
And this relationship, this sponsorship, Cereal for Brekkie, these 4 cereal companies were paying the Dietitians Association of Australia $23,000 a year for the Dietitians Association of Australia to use their members to influence, protect, and actively defend not only cereal and grains, but sugars messaging. So it all just started to click into place. It made total sense now why Gary was in so much trouble, because the cereal industry were using the Dietitians Association to silence Gary, to protect, because cereal sales were down.
That is an unbelievable point that we need to dig into. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, especially on social media, when you start to talk about these ties between food and follow the paper trail and follow the money and conspiracy theories, it's very hard for people to wrap their head around that. It almost sounds too good to be true. There's no tangible evidence. That's a lot of the pushback that I see on social media when I talk to some of this stuff. So the fact that you found written documents, one from the CEO of the Dietitians Association specifically stating for Gary to be silenced, and then 2, material proof of these 4 cereal companies that are paying off the Dietitians Association, that's unbelievable, because that's actual tangible evidence right there of the corruption that's going on.
Absolutely. And I just think, wow, how incredible that these cereal industries can have so much sway. And I don't believe dietitians understand how powerful so the Dietitians Association of Australia in Australia are not only the accrediting body for dietitians, but they're the educational body and their regulatory body. They've got no oversight. They do everything. So if a dietitian is to see a vegetarian position paper, for example, which I've looked into, they're going to accept that, their body as an educational, accrediting and regulatory body is giving them the best information possible. They may be unaware that Cereal for Brekkie is paying that body $23,000. I mean, if I'd known it was only $23,000 a year, I would have gone out playing music and donated money. We
could have crowdfunded the thing through the Meat Mafia and got it funded. Exactly.
Exactly. Like, this is ridiculous. And to have that much influence. So dietitians don't necessarily know where this information is coming from. But if they're told that the health benefits of cereals, grains, and soy is the gospel truth, they're going to believe it.
Yes.
Because that's what they're being told.
Yes.
And it's the same with medicine. It's the same with any group that is educated by the food industry inadvertently, or the pharmaceutical industry. If you're educated in that system, you believe what you're taught.
Yes.
And that's the challenge, I think, for a lot of people, and why there's so much pushback, because people have to challenge what they've learned. And the dietitian who actually reported Gary, we've never mentioned her name but APRA, this medical board, don't actually understand. And when they do redactions, they redacted her name, but they didn't understand Facebook, and all of her friend list was down the side. And Gary's got operating loops. He can do plastic surgery. So he put his operating loops on, and we got all the names and we worked out who it was. But she was really, really young and probably felt like she was doing the right thing. She was probably egged on by the older dietitians. Who knows if this CEO of the Dietitians Association of Australia, has written to the hospital twice. No doubt she's spoken to the dietitians there as well. So, people try to do the right thing, but if they're educated in the wrong way, then that's the concern. And as we'll go on, the concern in my research is that when something is a devout belief, it's very, very hard to challenge that belief. But there should be incredible transparency about it, because I might not ascribe to that belief. So why are we being told to eat a specific way?
And that's what's so interesting about Gary's story, and then doctors like Dr. Brian Lenskis and Dr. Filovadia, now 3 of the biggest doctors in the low carb space, but they did exactly what they were told. They were following the dietary guidelines. Like you mentioned, 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates a day. They're all trained. They have extensive medical expertise, medical backgrounds, and they're following these flawed nutritional principles, and they find themselves overweight, chronically ill, et cetera.
Yep.
So I just think that perfectly supports what you're saying.
Absolutely.
So what was your reaction? Because one of the things that you'd mentioned is how you're a photographer by trade, and you were really forced to step up and be the eyes, ears, and mouth to this entire thing, to be able to be the voice that Gary couldn't be. And then you're also going behind the scenes and doing all this research. When you stumbled upon some of the pieces of data that you just mentioned, what is your reaction when you're coming across this?
Well, I think I really started to look at this cereal industry because of the expert witness, and in particular Sanitarium. The Seventh-day Adventist Church here in Australia, and before I go any further, I'm not anti-vegan, I'm not anti-religion, I'm not anti-anything. I'm challenging the corporate church, particularly because of their influence and into the dietary guidelines. But I found it really challenging at first when I started to consider that this was a church that was only incorporated in 1863 with very, very strong beliefs on demonizing animal proteins and fats in the diet and promoting cereal, grains, and soy as, say, the gospel truth. So, where did this messaging come from? So I have honestly spent 8 years absolutely delved into the beliefs of the church, a lot of their research, a lot of the information they send out. And so it's not necessarily the individuals within the church, and even some of the people who are very high up, I truly believe they're doing the right thing. But unlike a lot of other religions around the world, which also have the Jewish religion has quite strict rules on what's clean and what's not clean in the way of meats and how to prepare meats and what you can put together and what you can't. Even the Catholic Church, in my research, I didn't realize that their concept of fasting is actually just not eating meat. So they're supposed to fast every single Friday. And one of the popes in the 80s said, okay, we don't actually have to stop eating red meat, but you've got to consider what you're doing. But McDonald's in Detroit, a very strong Catholic community, they had no sales on a Friday because no one was eating meat. So it was actually the Detroit McDonald entrepreneur that developed fillet of fish. Okay, got it. So, wow, did not know that. Okay, very interesting.
So
there is ways around. It's moral gymnastics. How do you get around all these sort of different dietary rules and things that you're supposed to do? I mean, Henry VIII apparently wrote that he was sick of eating fish because you're supposed to fast, which means don't eat meat for all of Lent. And every Friday he was not allowed to eat. He also wanted to marry another woman. And so the Catholic Bible didn't suggest that was allowed, but it was a combination apparently of the two. So when the New King James Bible was formed, and when he created the Church of England, he didn't have any rules about having to fast on Fridays. So he could eat meat whenever he wanted, and he was able to marry many times. But I think all of religions, so fascinating. And going back to creation stories, creation mythology, all of these different ideas of where we've come from. We've got evolutionary idea, which was attributed to turn a mental blank now. Help me.
Well, I'm drawing blank too.
That's all right.
It's fine.
Cut that out.
No,
okay. So you look back at evolution, and we're considered to have come from Africa back maybe 200,000 years ago as modern man, and we evolved from hunter-gathering.
Yes,
and it was apparently the high diet of animal proteins and fats that developed our brain to be able to be who we are now. But you've got the biblical creation saying that we were formed in the Garden of Eden, which is fruits, grains, nuts, and seeds. And then man developed after sin of taking fruit, the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge. Then you've got the creation mythology, which is incredible as well. And in Australia, particularly, you know, the Aboriginal people here, the First Nations peoples, are some of the oldest, or possibly the oldest civilization, continuing civilization in the world. And they've been around for 65,000 years. And I love that they have such an interconnectedness between people and land. Like they're people and spirit, spirit and people and spirit and country. Like it's all connected. And
Yes.
they understood, they had very distinct rules, not so much about what you could and you couldn't eat unless it was harmful, but they had special areas that they designated were sacred areas. And if animals or flora were growing in those spaces, that gave them the opportunity to regenerate. And so it was very much a respectful way of eating, which is how we really should be going back today. Whereas agriculture was founded about 12,000 years ago, and ever since we've been cropping and containing our food and being lazier, I guess, and growing things, we've certainly decreased in stature and had more and more health problems come across us. So looking into all of these different aspects has been incredible. So it's not just about, you know, the Seventh-day Adventist Church that I've been researching.
Yes.
But out of everything that I've looked at, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I believe, are the most influential. In fact, a guy called Joan Sabat wrote or co-authored an article called The Global Influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church on Diet, which pretty much tells it all. If I would have made that up if I could have.
No.
You know, it's a brilliant title. And he's even referenced some of my research. So
that's amazing.
You know, this is a church group that were taught by Ellen G. White, who founded or co-founded the church back in 1863. She taught that public health was part of their medical evangelism. They were to warn people of the dangers of flesh meat because she truly believed that the Garden of Eden diet, fruits, grains, nuts, and seeds, are the God-appointed diet for man, and we should not be eating any animal proteins or fats.
Wow.
Like, she was told by God in a vision in 1863 that meat was a toxic stimulant. It was considered as bad, if not worse, than alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine and spices, and that it would lead to, sorry.
No, it's okay. No worries at all.
She taught that eating flesh meat would defile people and it would lead not only men, but women and children to the heinous act of self-vice, which was the Puritan term for masturbation.
Got it.
So I did also, it's not my title, I did see that Cyril was part of an anti-masturbation crusade. And so you look back at Kellogg's and John Harvey Kellogg, he was actually raised as a devout Seventh-day Adventist. And when he was 12, he was invited into the home pretty much of James and Ellen White. And they organized for him to typeset their books and their newsletters, because printing at that stage was the only way you could get your message beyond, public speaking, of course, but, the printed message was so important. And so they had printing presses set up specifically. And so when he was 12, he was set to typeset Ellen White's book called A Solemn Appeal, and it was to mothers. And it only spoke of mothers deterring their children from the art of masturbation. And she believed that meat was the major cause of this.
And she believed this through a dream or a vision. Is that correct?
A vision. She had over 2,000 visions from God in her lifetime. But the temperance health reform movement, so temperance health reformers are quite different from the temperance movement, which was prohibition. The temperance health reform movement started in the early 1800s in the US. And you may have heard of Sylvester Graham, Caleb Jackson. These are a couple of other guys who also were very invested in eating bland cereals and bland foods and avoiding animal fats and protein because of the belief that it made people impure and defiled them. And James Connolly and I were chatting recently, and he had this brilliant idea, which I hadn't thought about, was that they were potentially looking at people in insane asylums because people were crazy. You know, it would decay their heads. It would make people crazy masturbating. But if you look at it from the other side, maybe these people were locked up and had nothing else to do, and they found that they'd masturbated, and they back correlated it to those things. So at the time, masturbation was considered a heinous sin to the Puritan movement. And so Ellen wasn't the first one to talk about it, but she was the very first one to say that she had a dream about it from God. And she was the first one to indoctrinate it into the church's principles and their beliefs, and this idea that they were to use medical evangelism to advocate to the public about the harms of red meat, the harms of flesh meat, the harms of eating animal products. She came to Australia in the 1890s. So John Harvey Kellogg had set up Kellogg's. He'd done lots of experimenting. I should have gone back. Can you add this bit back to the other bit?
Do you mind if I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, please.
I was just curious. So prior, because I remember, I think in Vinnie Tortorich's documentary Fat, he touches on that point with Ellen White. And I think one of the things he had mentioned was prior to that, you didn't really see any public displays over the demonization of animal products. Do you also find that to be true based on the research that you've done over the past 8 years?
Sorry, not
I was
before
just
Ellen
asking,
spoke about it.
Yeah, prior to Ellen speaking about it, had you seen any other examples of meat being demonized by other societies prior to that?
Absolutely. Vegetarianism in the East has been around since Pythagoras and Buddha. So there was definitely a movement in the East, but it was about nonviolence and a whole lot of other things. But specifically, it was about metempsychosis and this idea that if you did bad things, you would have karma attached to your soul, and potentially, if you hadn't done enough good things in your life, you may come back as an animal in your next life until you attain enough life cycles that you don't have karma, the bad karma anymore. So the fear was for Pythagoras, and certainly with a lot of the Eastern religions, that you would actually eat a relative if you were to eat an animal. So a lot of the vegetarianism was from that aspect, but no Eastern religion ever prohibited all of animal protein and fat. So some of them are allowed to eat fish, and certainly milk, ghee, butter, all of those things, they were included in the diet, because there's no way you can get vitamin B12 without supplementation in your diet without eating animal proteins and fats, and a lot of other of the micro and macronutrients that we need as well. So they weren't stupid. They realized people actually needed some form of animal fats, particularly. If you go back to the Western version of vegetarianism, it started in the early 1800s from the Bible Christian Society, which Sylvester Graham became part of. And they were very anti-meat. Vegetarian Society with Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's dad, and William Alcott, they started Fruitlands. So it was definitely happening. And I think temperance health reformers were speaking about the same things that Ellen White was apparently told in vision. So I read somewhere recently that Ellen White was still eating pork while the temperance health reformers were going around America saying, don't eat any meat. And then she'd have a vision from God telling her, oh, actually, we need to go back to the laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy and don't eat unclean foods. So then she said she was told by God not to eat pork. And then it went on to being all of flesh meat. So It was around, it was a thought about Puritan thoughts at the time, that eating meat would make you like an animal. But she specifically was told it was about masturbation and defiling people. And she was told by God that before translation, people would have to give up flesh meat. There was no way around it. So I guess if you have a belief system, if you're a part of a church with very devout beliefs, like there's no way someone in the Jewish faith would eat pork. So you've got a devout religion who's been taught that animal proteins and fats have to be out of the diet for salvation. They have to be out of the majority of people's diets. So they're meant to use this, like medical evangelism is the right arm of the church. The health reform message, which includes the demonization of animal proteins and fats, is part of the entering wedge. And Ellen taught that this was a way of opening hearts and minds to their version of the gospel message. This is how we can get it in. We can talk about food. We can talk about cooking. We can talk about all of these sort of things. We're not talking about the Bible. That will come later. So that's how they've managed to get into China, and how they've managed to get into other third world countries is by going in talking about health, going in talking about food and nutrition. And then when they're ready for it, then you talk about their version of the gospel. And until enough people have heard their version of the gospel, Jesus will not return. So they are honestly on a mission. She told them that they were the, Ellen G. White taught that the Seventh-day Adventist Church were the remnant church. They were God's chosen people. They were the spiritual children of Israel. And if the original children of Israel had followed all of his commandments and done all of the things that God had asked them, Jesus would have already come back, or the world would have finished. So they've got a commission to, they're actually an apocalyptic church. They are praying for the end of the world because they want to go back to heaven, and they want life to just be perfect in the Garden of Eden and just eat fruit, nuts, and seeds.
It's unbelievable to hear you lay out the history like that. So basically, so they think that they're God's chosen people. They're trying to convert as many people to this specific sect of, what is it, Christian Protestant?
Even if we don't convert, as long as we get rid of all the meat, because Jesus is not going to come back while we're all eating meat when heaven's about eating fruit, nuts, and seeds.
Okay.
So, it's a waste of his time to come back when no one's ready. So they have to get their gospel message out. I don't know that we all have to become Seventh-day Adventists, but they certainly want to completely get rid of animal protein and fat out of the diet. And their way of trying to do that is to get into dietary guidelines, to get into research. The Adventist health studies, I don't know, they're massive. They've been researching the health benefits of vegetarianism since the 1950s. And it's massively funded by the National Institute of Health in the US. And these research papers are funded and talked about over and over and over again. But if you go into the fine print, because you know me, I like the fine print.
Yes.
If you go into the fine print, you'll actually see that to be considered to be eating a vegan diet means that you eat meat less than once a month. And a vegetarian eats meat less than once a week. But the problem is that's not the message that the general public understand.
No.
If you talk to someone about the health benefits of a vegan diet, they honestly believe that there's no animal proteins or fats in that diet anywhere.
Not at all. Zero.
But the Adventist health studies realize you need some. So to be a vegan, classify as a vegan, in these studies, you can still eat meat once a month, which may be enough to maintain health. So
it's almost like there's so much information. It's tough for you to fit everything in because it's so nuanced and it's saying all the little things that you mix in.
It absolutely is. There's so much. And someone suggested I write a book, and I said it would be bigger than War and Peace. I don't think anyone would read it.
I think it would be bigger than War and Peace, but I think a lot of people would be very interested to read it. And I think the reason why they would is because I view this Seventh-day Adventist church almost as like the silent puppeteers that are pulling the strings on nutrition. And I would guarantee you, we have a very informed audience. I guarantee you that there's people that are listening to this that, one, don't even know what the Seventh-day Adventist church even is. And number two, just their connection to nutrition and our dietary guidelines. So I think that was one of the things I wanted to ask you is, how have they been so successful at infiltrating their nutritional views into our dietary guidelines that we currently have?
Well, the interesting thing is, as I say, I was starting to look at it in Australia, but because the Seventh-day Adventist Church have a very, very small footprint in Australia, they've only got one major hospital, which is in New South Wales and Sydney. They've got a few satellite, smaller private hospitals in New South Wales, but nowhere else in Australia. Their biggest thing is this food industry. Their food department, commercial arm, comes under the charity status of the church, and they pay no tax on any processed foods that they make or any of their corporate health and wellness programs. So that is a concern, which I've discovered over time. But this Sanitarium Health and Wellbeing Company, they are hugely influential. Not only do they provide the breakfast cereal, and they say Aussie kids are Wheat Bix kids, because really Aussie kids are Wheat Bix kids. We've been brainwashed for so long. But I wasn't aware of how involved they were. They actually provided, because somebody told me about it, GP told me about it a few years ago, and I posted and wrote about it, a big article about it. But Sanitarium was providing fact sheets for GPs, general practitioners here in Australia.
Wow.
And it was in their medical software. And all I had to do was push a button, say for type 2 diabetes, on their computer, and out came a branded, beautifully presented fact sheet about type 2 diabetes, of course, encouraging people to minimize animal proteins and fats. The one on pregnancy even included eating Wheat Bix as part of their dietary recommendations. Doctors hadn't even realized. That's how ingrained we are to believing that Sanitarium is providing health and wellness to our community. That is ridiculous.
It's scary too, honestly.
It is scary. And I think I mentioned to you, I was talking about this, the Dietitians Association being the educational body for dietitians. So I wanted to look up the vegetarian position paper. Sorry. I think I told you about the Dietitians Association being the education body for dietetics.
Yes.
So I'd come across a guy called Reese Southern, who had written an incredible blog in the US. Let Them Eat Meat, it was called. Unfortunately, it's come down. But he had done the most incredibly extensive researched blog on everything to do with the Seventh-day Adventist Church being involved in the American Dietary Guidelines. And unbelievable. So when I came across his work, because I think I was looking for it in ours, came across his, thought, okay, I'm going to look at the vegetarian position paper here in Australia, only to find it was all written by the Seventh-day Adventist Church and 2 members of Kellogg's. So I said to a couple of dietitians, did you realize that this is the references when you look at this position paper? And they said to me, the position paper came out from the Dietitians Association of Australia and we believed it. We never went looking at the references. And I think that's what this is sort of about. A lot of health professionals don't have time to do all the research. When you're given something from your peak body, you take it as proper information. You take it as, this is it. You don't question and challenge and necessarily read all the references, because some of them have a lot of references. So in America, you have got the Sunshine Act. We don't have anything like that here in Australia. So because the Seventh-day Adventist Church don't own any universities here, nobody is trained necessarily. There is some postgraduate training in lifestyle medicine at the university college, but there's no specific training for doctors. So I wasn't able to find out necessarily. In Australia, people are very quiet about their religion as well. And so I wasn't able to determine who may or who may not be a Seventh-day Adventist with some of the research I was looking at, unless they'd done research with someone in America. Because of the Sunshine Act, you have to acknowledge who might have financially funded you if you own stocks and shares. And so when an Australian does it with an American, then they have to list it on that same thing. So I was able to get a lot of information. So even though I'm talking about the Seventh-day Adventist Church, my research has also looked very much at pharmaceutical industry funding and at the food industry, and in particular Coca-Cola. So they have a massive influence on dietary and health education as well. And so because it's so small here in Australia, but the Sanitarium Health and Wellbeing group also run as I say, they're the biggest provider of health and wellness programs here in Australia, and they certainly do a lot in America as well. The CHIP program, which was actually developed by an American but bought by Sanitarium, and they have the rights now, it's been rebranded as Pivio Health in America. But all the funds go back to the Seventh-day Adventist Church here in Australia. When this is taken into like places like Cummins and Vanderbilt University, we're talking big groups that are taking on this Pivio Health. And what I came across again from this expert witness that was brought in for Gary was that he was the patron of the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine. So a big lot of my research has been into the lifestyle medicine movement, which was founded in America at Loma Linda University. So John Kelly was the founder in 2003, and it was called the Christian Association of Lifestyle Medicine at the time. 2004, it became the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, and in Australia, I think we started a few years later. But now, under the umbrella of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, you have got satellite groups all around the world, and it is based on the belief that animal proteins and fats are bad, and grains and cereals and soy are good. And they're not all Seventh-day Adventists. At the beginning, all 9 members were Seventh-day Adventist church members. But as time's gone on, we had a couple of key people, including the person who founded the Global Energy Balance Network from Coca-Cola, join the American College of Lifestyle Medicine on their board. And so that made me really question this symbiotic relationship and start to look. And if you consider nutrition science, so consider it from Gary's side, you've got macro and micronutrients, you've got essential vitamins, essential proteins, and essential fatty acids. These are things that we need. This is actually science. And so my side of the nutrition science has been looking at all the non-science. And I'm not knocking all of that either, because people have ethical beliefs and they have religious beliefs. But the vested interests, the food industry, the pharmaceutical industry have definitely been manipulating nutrition science as the non-science side of things. And in my research in particular, I've come down and looked at Coca-Cola's messaging, and their public health message is to minimize the harms of sugar. So it's quite a distinct public health message to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which are intent on promoting the health benefits of fruits, nuts, and seeds as the biblical Garden of Eden diet. But if you think about it, demonizing animal proteins and fats works for both. So watching this symbiotic relationship develop between these two makes perfect sense when you think about it. And they can both stand up and, prophesize the health benefits of the plant-biased Garden of Eden diet. Eating plants, it benefits both. And I've gone right back in my research to uncover the very first Adventist health study, which was done by Mervyn Harding, a devout Seventh-day Adventist, who wanted to do research to prove, not disprove, divine inspiration. And he went to Fred Stair at Harvard University to do his doctoral thesis. So imagine Fred Stair's head just exploding when here he was getting money from the food industry to minimize the harms of sugar. And instead, he's got this man with no conflicts of interest, financial conflicts of interest, a devout belief that we don't need animal proteins and fats in our diet. And he wants to do his doctoral dissertation with him. Yes. So, of course, the first 3 studies are done at Harvard University under Fred Stair, who's been found to have been very involved with the food industry. Kristen Cairns and Gary Taubes have done some amazing work back into his, but it started then. And now if you look at the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, this Coca-Cola messaging, so they've started an initiative called Exercise is Medicine. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yes, I have.
Coca-Cola. Yeah. So, it's all about calories in, calories out, and global, and it's about the energy balance and things. So the global energy balance was tried to be formed in about 2015. And that was going to be another repository for Coca-Cola. They had ILSI that they founded in 1978, which has got 400 food, pharmaceutical, even started with tobacco, but it's got biotech and chemical companies all working on research to potentially minimize the harms of any cereal, grains, and soy, and maximize and demonize animal proteins and fats. Then they tried to start the global energy balance. Stephen Blair came in and he wanted to start that in 2015. Interestingly, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine partnered with them, and they started to get this incredible relationship happening, and they were promoting exercise as medicine. And then the global energy balance was called out by Anna Haddow O'Connor at the New York Times. Like, phew. So global energy balance went. The European Society of Lifestyle Medicine shut everything down because they'd been very involved, and they changed URLs, they changed names, they got different people on the boards, still the same few people, but that really exploded. The Australian group changed their URLs and changed up and called themselves a different name. The American College of Lifestyle Medicine, it didn't change. So I've had to go back into the Wayback Machine to find all these other bits of information and where they're involved. But the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, I truly believe, is founded, or their exams and their writing and everything else. So if you decide you want to become a member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, or a member of the International Board of Lifestyle Medicine, or whatever they're trying to create, their actual textbooks and their basic things are all based on the biblical Garden of Eden diet as a belief from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and the messaging from Coca-Cola.
Wow.
This group is getting into medical education in America. They're into at least 6 universities, and they're trying to become all universities. The American College of Lifestyle Medicine got accepted by the American Medical Association. If you look at, I've got a lot of research on my website, isupportgary.com, and it will be a bit funny, even though my godson says, Belinda, I'm a doctor, I'm not going to go to I Love Gary website. You need to start something else. But at the moment, it's still on the I Support Gary website, about these intricate connections between all of these groups. And medical education taught doctors to fear fat from the 1970s. And now, potentially, they're going to be taught to fear animal proteins as well. But it's okay to have a little bit of Coca-Cola on the side, because as long as you exercise, you'll be right. So yes, this is a very, very scary place that we're getting to.
Yeah. And I apologize to the listener, because I think I've said wow 100 times, and I don't mean to, but it's like, I think that I'm pretty up to speed on, I don't know if you want to call it corruption, or just being able to connect the dots backwards to understand why we're in the metabolic crisis that we're currently in. But just listening to you speak, it's so interesting, because you have this one theme of religious dogma. We were talking about Ellen White and John Harvey Kellogg, and all of it's based on the suppression of masturbatory thoughts and guilt and lust and all of that. Mm-hmm. And then that ends up being the genesis for Kellogg's, which ends up being this multinational corporation, billions upon billions of dollars. So you have this religious dogma, then you have corporate greed, profits, all the incentives that go into that, and then all the resources that they've accumulated over the last century. And they're just so embedded, and they're so ingrained into our current dietary system that it's tough to get out of it. So that's why my mind is blown, because it makes so much sense the way that you're describing everything right now.
Okay. You ready for the next mind blow?
I think so. I hope so. Yeah.
Okay. I honestly believe the Adventist health reform message is just embedding itself in the fabric of American society at this point in time. And I'll back that up by saying Advent Health bought the rights to the Blue Zones project. I don't know if you've heard of Blue Zones. Heard of Blue Zones?
Yes.
They're meant to be places of health and longevity dotted around the world. I'll come back to that in a sec. But Adventist Health have bought the rights to the Blue Zones project in 2020. And just last year at the US 89th Congress of Mayors, 1,400 mayors have signed up to include Blue Zones in their communities. So now you've got 1,400 communities that have all signed up for the Adventist health reform doctrine. Yeah, the Blue Zones, if you look back at Michel Puller and Giovanni Pessa's original work, they're demographers, and they were looking at Sardinia. I mean, the whole Blue Zone was decided because this small area in Sardinia, when they drew a circle around it with a blue highlighter pen, it became blue. So that's where it's come from. Okay. Very simple. Okay. And if you look at the demography that they were talking about, there wasn't a single hospital bed in this area in Sardinia I think that shows something that was very, very important there. In America, how many hospital beds? You've got Seventh-day Adventist Church own 84 hospitals there, plus so many outpatients clinics and whatever else. It's unbelievable. I say we've got one in Australia, one major one. So this Blue Zones project, originally found by Michel Poulin and Giovanni Pes, and they were highlighting Okinawa, Sardinia, Icaria in Greece, and it was not until Dan Buttner went on a tour with National Geographic in 2005, and I think my hypothesis, I can't guarantee it, but I would believe that he would have looked at these blue zones around the world and think, we must have one in America, because we need a story. So let's find one in America. And of course, the blue zone in America is Loma Linda, which is where about a third of their population are devout Seventh-day Adventists. And there's no doubt the concept of not drinking alcohol, not smoking, not taking drugs, being in a tight-knit community. In our normal society, certainly when Gary started giving up sugar, we'd go out for dinner and everyone would go, oh, come on, you don't have to give up, dessert, because it makes people feel bad. So you've got a lot of social pressure to keep eating in a certain way. But at Loma Linda, these Seventh-day Adventists have no
there's no pressure, right?
Because
it's accepted. Yeah, it's widely accepted.
It's not just accepted, but you're more pure if you choose not to do those things. So, there's none of that. There are some people who are living some very, very long lives in Loma Linda. But my grandfather lived to 98 and he swam and he ate meat. So, he was also he was in a very close knit community in a little island off Victoria. So there are a whole lot of points that you can look at here. But I think the demographers, when they did their original blue zones, were looking at communities that were isolated, that were self-sufficient. They raised livestock, they raised crops. They just didn't have the Western sugars, the highly processed carbs, and the polyunsaturated oils. They did not have those things. And yes, potentially they lived long, happy lives. Was it an intersection of potentially their longevity, that they'd been born a certain amount of time, had grown up and been nourished really, really well, and then actually had access to modern medicine? Was that another reason that some of these people were getting long lives? There's a whole lot of things to consider, but not a single one of those blue zones that were identified by the demographers demonized animal proteins and fats. In fact, all of them used lard for cooking. At Loma Linda, lard is obviously an unclean meat. I read somewhere that Ellen G. White touched a pig once and she burnt all of her clothes. She took them all off and burnt them. It was that disgusting to her. So, this messaging from the blue zones has gone from some amazing communities to suddenly become a plant-based diet. And if you look at the graphics of the Blue Zones project, it's 95% to 100% plant slant. When you adopt these blue zone communities, when you want to get accreditation to be a blue zone, you have to get on board your mayor. So obviously 1,400 mayors have already signed up. So that's an easy thing. You have to get, a certain amount of businesses. You have to get the schools on board. So I know already in America, they're trying to get rid of animal proteins and fats in school canteens and from schools. This is going to just impact it even more. These kids are going to learn that animal proteins and fats are bad. I read in 2018 that to become Blue Zone accredited, it was going to cost the community more than $6.5 million.
$6.5 million.
To become Blue Zone accredited. Now they've got 1,400 mayors signed up to that. They also, because it's Advent Health, they also own so many hospitals. I think it's 75 hospitals, outpatients, different things that they potentially have communities on the East Coast and in Hawaii. And so they already have 10 million people that they think will be under their footprint. Plus you've now added all of these groups. So yeah, I've looked into so many things and it's undercover. You don't actually understand. And it might just sound like a good thing. Great. We're going to be blue zones. We're going to be healthy. We're going to be, but are people understanding how persuasive this demonization of animal proteins and fats actually is.
Yeah. And it's a great point, because now there's this branding and credentialism around blue zones automatically being considered healthy. So if you can plug in the Seventh-day Adventism, the Garden of Eden diet with the blue zone, you're able to kind of subconsciously embed that into the uninformed consumer's mind. And it is terrifying. Particularly, I lived in New York for 3 years, and New York City is the perfect example. Mayor Eric Adams, who's plant-based, pushing his own dietary dogmatism on the kids, where they're doing meatless Mondays and vegan Fridays, and these poor kids, right? Let alone just the correlation between saturated animal fat and healthy brain development, bone development, et cetera. Now they're subconsciously thinking that meat is terrible for them, dairy is terrible for them. And it makes you worry by the time that they're in their mid-20s, what are they going to be like? Are they going to be metabolically thriving? Or are they not going to be metabolically thriving? But either way, they're not even getting the opportunity to choose. They're just being told that animal products are not good for them, and they're being forced to adopt these, dietary restrictions.
Absolutely. And I just think, sorry, Brett. No. Absolutely. This is really, really big. And if people don't understand the undercurrent of this messaging, you just go, oh, well, blue zones, that's fantastic. I've heard blue zones have got health and longevity, and how amazing. Talking about New York City, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, one of the board members, Michelle Mackin, she's just been taken on as the director of lifestyle medicine in every hospital in New York.
Wow.
So, and she's a devout vegan. I don't know if she's necessarily Seventh-day Adventist, but she'll happily call herself like a vegan doctor. And so now he has just put lifestyle medicine in New York City in every hospital. So it's big. And I think if you look at lifestyle medicine, you look at the blue zones, you look at sanitarium here in Australia, these are big entities that are just getting very subtle messaging in. I understand from Frederick Leroy, the World Health Economic Forum, like we've got big players invested in fake meats and alternative meats. So it's really big. But in Australia, the biggest producer of alternative meats is the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And what's interesting is they bury it under, because everyone's got this idea that Sanitarium's this health and wellbeing company. They brand it everywhere. They tell us over and over again. But they've got another layer down lower, and it's called the Life Health Foods. And under that is their alternative meat company. So whereas Sanitarium has this beautiful banner, it's got wheat flowing, and it just all looks happy and healthy and lovely, if you like wheat. But it's not an aggressive, it's not a challenging website at all. But the alternative meat company are putting out all of that marketing about, you hear the propaganda, and cows causing this and cows causing that. And it's owned by the church. And people don't necessarily realize when they go and buy alternative meat company meat or the alternative milk company that they're actually come under Sanitarium a few layers down. So, Ellen G. White came to Australia, I meant to mention it before. Ellen G. White came to Australia in 1890, and she set up the health food business. She wanted it to be like Kellogg's company, which wasn't owned by the church in Battle Creek Sanitarium. It was owned by him. So she came to Australia to set it up. Same sort of principles. In fact, she got Edward Halsey, who was one of the chief bakers, to come to Australia and help set it up. But she said, the health food business is to take the place of flesh meat, milk, and butter. That's what it was designed to do. And they have been very, very successful in creating this thing. Sanitarium partners with so many different groups. And now they've partnered here in Australia with Life Health Education. So it's a bit like the blue zones in America. Life Health Education goes to every single primary school in Australia. And now they're going to be getting Sanitarium's messaging with it. I keep trying to call it out. I keep being noisy. I can't be as funny as Gary because it's a serious conversation. But this is really scary. And thank you so much for letting me come on and just tell to more people, because there's only so much I can do on my own on my website.
I mean, I'm not kidding. This is easily one of the top 3 most informative conversations that I've personally ever had on here. I think Harry is going to be kicking himself because he missed this conversation. And I'm not just saying this. We would love to have you on for a part 2. But one of the questions that I wanted to leave you with is, because I think it's very easy to come away from this information, the corruption, dogma, overwhelmed, negative. When you think about the future of society, are you generally hopeful? Just kind of curious your thoughts on the future, and if you think that there is maybe a solution to all this that's going on.
Well, I think there is a solution. And I'm so excited because I've always said to Gary, we've talked about it and just said, how incredible. If the cereal industry hadn't come after Gary, we would never have met all these incredible people. Like, I would never have done the research. Gary might not have even met Rod Taylor in the first place with Low Carb Down Under. This is an incredible network of people. And I think this community is building and we can make a difference. Mm-hmm. And I'll go back to Harvey Wiley. I know Coca-Cola is still big, but Harvey Wiley was a chemist who was involved in passing the Pure Food and Drug Act back in the early 1900s. And he discovered that at every single level, Coca-Cola blocked him from getting cocaine out of their product. So, they'd pay off different people at different levels of Congress. And he was so frustrated, even though the Pure Food and Drug Act finally passed, it still couldn't stop Coca-Cola. So what he did was he just went, you know what? I'm going to go and work for a women's magazine, because the women are the ones who are going to do the buying. The women are the ones who are nourishing their families. And if I can't change policy, that's where I'm going to go. And I think that's what you guys are doing. That's what this community is doing. We're going to the people and saying, you can take back control of your health. You can choose what you want to buy. You can make those decisions. And we don't need governments dictating policy to us to make us healthy.
Yes. And that's an amazing point. And to everything that you're saying, it's about I think the universe needs people that are willing to speak up like yourself now more than ever, and having open conversations like this. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for people to arm themselves with resources that they can send to family and friends to correct the narrative. So like your blog is a go-to piece of information for us, the isupportgary.com, like we mentioned, we'll link to it in the show notes. But also for someone that might not be as big of a reader, having good documentaries like Sacred Cow or Fat,
absolutely,
quick hitters that you can send to people to really correct their paradigm understanding of nutrition is so important. And I think just continuing to spread the right message, because we know what the truth is about nutrition, and we know the way that people can thrive and reverse chronic diseases. And we just need to be willing to speak up and share that message. And I just hope that anyone that's listening to this kind of feels empowered to do that, because I know that that's something that you've done for years, and you've been a huge inspiration for us on the podcast. So just truly thank you so much for the work that you've been doing, and just hope to meet you in person one day and actually be able to continue the conversation.
Thanks so much, Brett. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Belinda.